It was a beautiful afternoon in a small church in Texas. Friends and family had gathered, eager to witness the union of a loving couple. The bride, dressed in an elegant white gown, stood at the altar, her hands trembling slightly as she faced the man she was about to marry. Everything seemed perfect until the priest suddenly paused. His expression changed, his eyes narrowing as he noticed something unsettling about the bride. A heavy silence fell over the room. Then, he took a deep breath and spoke, revealing a truth that left everyone in shock. As the ceremony proceeded, Father Michael couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. He had officiated hundreds of weddings, but something about this bride felt off. Her hands trembled slightly, not unusual for a nervous bride, but her complexion seemed unusually pale, almost grayish under the soft glow of the church lights. Beads of sweat dotted her forehead, despite the cool air inside the chapel. Then, as she reached for the groom's hands, Father Michael noticed it. Her fingers had a bluish tint. His heart skipped a beat. He had seen this before years ago in a medical emergency at a charity event. A creeping suspicion took hold of him. He cleared his throat and gently asked, "My dear, are you feeling all right?" The bride blinked, startled. "Why, yes, just a little nervous," she whispered, forcing a smile. But Father Michael wasn't convinced. He glanced at the groom, who seemed oblivious to his bride's condition, his face glowing with joy. The guests shifted in their seats, sensing the tension in the air. A sudden sway, a sharp gasp. The bride's knees buckled. Before anyone could react, she collapsed right there at the altar. The room erupted into chaos. The groom fell to his knees, cradling her, panic flashing in his eyes. Father Michael rushed forward, his old medical training kicking in. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse was weak, too weak. "She needs help now," he shouted. As someone called 911, Father Michael's mind raced. He knew exactly what this could be, and if he was right, the truth behind it would change everything. The church erupted into chaos. Guests gasped and stood from their seats, some rushing toward the altar, while others froze in confusion. The groom cradled the bride, his voice shaking. "Sarah, wake up." Father Michael knelt beside her, his fingers still on her pulse. It was faint, too faint. His mind worked fast. The bluish tint on her fingers, the sweating, the sudden collapse. He had seen this before. It was a sign of severe oxygen deprivation. Just as paramedics burst through the church doors, Father Michael turned to the groom. "Does she have any medical conditions?" he asked urgently. The groom, pale with fear, shook his head. "Not that I know of. She's always been healthy." The paramedics worked quickly, placing an oxygen mask over the bride's face and checking her vitals. One of them frowned as he lifted her sleeve to insert N4. Then he froze. Father Michael saw it too, a deep bruise on her upper arm. Not the kind from a simple bump, this looked like an injection site. The paramedic looked up sharply. "Has she been taking any medication? Or anything else?" The groom's face twisted in confusion. "No, she never said anything about it." He turned to Father Michael in desperation. "What's happening? What's wrong with her?" Father Michael's jaw tightened. Something was terribly wrong. One of the paramedics pulled out a small flashlight and gently opened the bride's eyes. Then he cursed under his breath. Her pupils, their pinpoints. The other paramedic's eyes widened. Possible opioid overdose. We need Narcan now. The entire church fell silent. The groom looked like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. That's not possible, he stammered. Sarah doesn't do drugs. Father Michael exchanged a knowing glance with the paramedics. This wasn't recreational drug use. The signs pointed to something else, something more sinister. Then, as they administered the Narcan, the bride's eyelids fluttered. She gasped, sucking in air like she had been drowning. Her eyes darted around in confusion until they landed on the groom. Tears welled up in her eyes, and then, in a weak, trembling voice, she whispered for words that sent a chill through the room. He tried to kill me. Gasps rippled through the church. The groom's face went pale, his eyes wide with shock. What? He stammered. Sarah, what are you talking about? Sarah's breaths were shallow, her body weak from whatever had been in her system. The Narcan had jolted her back, but she was still fragile. Her fingers gripped Father Michael's sleeve as she turned to him, her lips trembling. She swallowed hard, trying to find the strength. He put something in my drink. Last night, I felt dizzy. Then I don't remember anything. The groom shook his head violently. No, that's insane. I would never hurt you. His voice was frantic, desperate. I love you. But the paramedics exchanged glances. One of them turned to the police officer who had arrived with them. This looks like more than just a medical emergency, he said grimly. The officer stepped forward. Sir, I need you to come with me for questioning. The groom's expression twisted in anguish. He turned to the guests, to Father Michael, as if begging someone to believe him. This is a mistake. I didn't do anything. Sarah's mother ran to her daughter's side, tears in her eyes. Sweetheart, what's going on? Sarah swallowed hard, her mind racing as pieces of the night before came back to her. She had felt strange, drowsy. She remembered collapsing on the hotel bed, thinking she had simply had too much wine. But now the realization hit her like a thunderbolt. Someone had drugged her. But was it really the groom? Her blurry memories weren't clear enough. She looked at him, his face a mix of fear and confusion. Was he truly guilty, or had she just accused the wrong person? A sudden noise made everyone turn. From the back of the church, a figure slipped toward the doors. The groom's best man, Jason. Father Michael caught the movement instantly. Jason's face was ghostly white, sweat dripping down his forehead. His hands trembled as he reached for the door handle, trying to leave unnoticed. Something about the way he moved sent a chill down Father Michael's spine. Then Sarah gasped. Her eyes widened as a memory crashed into her mind like a tidal wave. It wasn't the groom who had handed her the wine last night. It was Jason. Her breath caught in her throat. Wait, she whispered, her heart pounding. It wasn't him. It was. Before she could finish, Jason bolted. The officer shouted, "Stop him!" Father Michael didn't think, he moved. As Jason dashed for the exit, the priest grabbed a heavy brass candle holder from the altar and flung it forward. It struck Jason's leg just as he reached the door. With a strangled yell, Jason stumbled, crashing onto the floor as the officer lunged and pinned him down. The church was in chaos. Guests murmured in shock, the groom's face shifting from despair to disbelief as he looked at his so-called best friend. Jason thrashed, but the officer locked the handcuffs around his wrists. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," the officer growled. Sarah, still weak, shook her head in horror. "Why, Jason?" Jason's breathing was ragged. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but there was none. Then, as if something inside him snapped, he laughed bitterly. "You were never supposed to wake up," he muttered. Silence. Father Michael felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was no accident, no misunderstanding. This had been an attempted murder. And Jason had just confessed. The church was dead silent, the weight of Jason's words sinking in like a stone thrown into deep water. "You were never supposed to wake up." Sarah's breath hitched, her entire body trembling. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason let out a hollow chuckle, his shoulders slumping as if all the fight had drained out of him. The officer hauled him up, but he didn't resist. He just shook his head, a dark smirk playing on his lips. "You really have no idea, do you?" The groom, Mark, stepped forward, his face twisted in confusion and fury. "Jason, why the hell would you do this?" His voice cracked. "You're my best friend." Jason's eyes flicked to Mark, and for the first time, something other than arrogance or fear crossed his face. Regret. "It wasn't supposed to be this way," Jason muttered. "You were never supposed to marry her." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. "Why?" Jason clenched his jaw, but before he could answer, the officer gave him a hard nudge. "You can talk at the station," he said gruffly. "No." Father Michael's voice cut through the tension like a blade. His usually kind eyes were sharp, filled with quiet authority. "He talks now." Jason swallowed, looking around the church at the horrified guests at Mark. His best friend, the man he had just betrayed. He sighed, and finally the truth came spilling out. "I was trying to protect you," he said, looking at Mark. "From her." Sarah's heart pounded. "Protect him? From me?" Jason scoffed. "You think you're some innocent bride, Sarah?" His gaze darkened. "I know who you really are." Silence. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "That's a lie," she snapped. "I have nothing to hide." Jason let out a bitter laugh. "Really?" He turned back to Mark, eyes full of twisted pity. "Did you ever wonder why she never talked much about her past? Why she never mentioned her family?" Mark's expression wavered. "She told me her parents died when she was young." Jason smirked. "And you just believed her? Without ever questioning it?" Mark hesitated. Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. "Because it's the truth," she said, but her voice was shakier now. Jason shook his head. "No, it's not." Father Michael studied Sarah carefully. "What are you trying to say, Jason?" Jason took a deep breath. "Her real name isn't Sarah Miller. It's Rachel Carter. And 5 years ago, she was engaged to another man before he mysteriously vanished." Gasps filled the church. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. "No," she whispered. "That's not true." but deep down she knew it was. Jason's voice dropped lower, full of venom. And I wasn't going to let my best friend be next. Mark took a step back, his face pale as a ghost. Sarah, is this true? Sarah's lips parted, but no words came out. The secret she had fought so hard to bury was finally out. The church was suffocatingly silent. All eyes were on Sarah. Mark's face was ashen, his hands trembling. Sarah, he whispered, tell me it's not true. Sarah's breath came in short, uneven gasps. Her past, a past she had desperately tried to escape, had just crashed down around her. There was no more hiding. She turned to Mark, her eyes welling with tears. She hesitated, her voice cracking. My real name was Rachel Carter. A ripple of gasps spread through the guests. But I didn't kill him, I swear. Mark took a shaky step back, his jaw clenched. Then what happened? Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the truth pressing against her chest. I was engaged before, she admitted, to a man named Daniel, but he wasn't who everyone thought he was. She looked at Jason, her voice trembling but firm. You think I was hiding from my past, but I wasn't. I was running for my life. Jason's smug expression faltered. Sarah turned back to Mark, pleading. Daniel was dangerous, controlling. He didn't let me have friends, didn't let me leave the house without his permission. And when I tried to leave, he snapped. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He tried to kill me. Tears spilled down her cheeks. The night he disappeared, I thought he was dead. But I never killed him. I ran. I changed my name. I built a new life. Because I knew, if he was still alive, he'd come for me. Jason scoffed. Convenient story. Sarah shook her head. You don't believe me? Fine. But ask yourself this. If I were some cold-blooded killer, why would I nearly die at my own wedding? Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. The logic hit him like a truck. Father Michael, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Jason, he said firmly, who told you about Sarah's past? Jason blinked. What? Who gave you that information? The priest repeated, stepping closer. Jason hesitated. Then, slowly, realization dawned on his face. A man called me, he admitted. Said he had proof that Sarah was dangerous. He sent me files, photos, told me she was a killer, that I had to stop the wedding before it was too late. Sarah's blood turned to ice. No, couldn't be. Father Michael's voice was grave. Jason, did this man ever give you his name? Jason swallowed. Yeah, he said his name was. He trailed off, his face going pale. Sarah's lips parted, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel. A shiver ran through the room. Jason looked like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had been used, manipulated into stopping the wedding, not to save Mark, but to flush Sarah out. A slow, terrible realization settled over everyone. Daniel was still alive, and he was watching. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the church as the doors creaked open. Someone was standing in the doorway. A tall figure in a dark suit, watching, smiling. Sarah's breath hitched. She recognized that face. Daniel had found her. The guests screamed as the police officer turned, reaching for his gun. But Daniel was faster. A gunshot rang out. Mark lunged forward, shielding Sarah as the bullet slammed into a wooden pew, splintering it. Chaos erupted. The officer tackled Daniel, knocking the gun from his hand. Jason, shaken but determined, jumped in to help restrain him. Daniel snarled, thrashing, "You think you can escape me, Rachel? You think changing your name would save you?" His voice was dripping with venom. "You're mine." Sarah stood, her entire body shaking, but her eyes, for the first time in years, were filled with fire instead of fear. "No," she said, stepping closer. "I'm not yours." With one swift motion, she picked up the fallen candle holder, the same one Father Michael had used earlier, and swung it hard against Daniel's head. He collapsed unconscious. Breathing heavily, Sarah dropped the candle holder. Her hands were still trembling, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from relief. The police cuffed Daniel, dragging him away as the guests slowly regained their senses. Jason, guilt-stricken, turned to Mark. "I swear, I thought I was protecting you," he muttered. Mark, still shaken, exhaled sharply. "You almost got Sarah killed," he said. But then, after a pause, he added, "But I know now you were tricked too." Jason looked away, ashamed. Sarah turned to Mark, holding her breath. "Do you believe me?" she asked softly. Mark met her eyes. He had been moments away from walking away, from believing the worst. But now, looking at her, at everything she had been through, everything she had survived, he realized the truth. He stepped forward and took her hands. "I believe you." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. For the first time in years, she was finally free. Father Michael, after a long moment, cleared his throat. "Well," he said, voice warm despite the chaos, "if the bride and groom are still willing," he gestured toward the altar. A stunned silence followed. Then, slowly, a smile crept onto Mark's face. He turned to Sarah. "What do you say?" he asked gently. "Still want to marry me?" Sarah let out a breathless, teary laugh. After all this? She wiped her eyes. "Yes." The guests, stunned, exhausted, but overwhelmed with relief, burst into cheers. And there, in the same church where she had almost died, Sarah Miller. Not Rachel Carter, not a woman running from her past, but the woman she had fought to become, finally got her happy ending.